1968, one of the most famous psychological experiments concerning racism was conducted by a grade 3 teacher living in a small town in Iowa. Now, this teacher was Jane Elliott. The day before her experiment was April 4th, 1968. That will sound familiar. That was the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead. Now, in the wake of that tragedy, Elliott decided that she wanted to teach her kids, the kids in her class, about the negative effects of bigotry. Now, bigotry, once defined, is the unreasonable or unfounded disliking of a person or group based on their membership in a particular group. But Jane Elliott, she wasn't going to provide a definition on the chalkboard. What she wanted to do was actually allow her students to live what bigotry is like. They were going to enact the meaning. She divided her class. She divided it by eye color. Those with blue eyes were on one side of the room, and they were separated from those with darker eyes, whether it was brown or hazel. And she explained. She said, the people with brown eyes, darker eyes, they're better than the people with the blue eyes. And to get her students to believe her, she said, listen, this is based on the science. She said, science showed that the dark-eyed people, the color of their eyes was caused by a chemical called melanin. And the science also showed that melanin was related to intelligence and self-control. Therefore, darker-eyed people, she said, darker-eyed people, their eyes signaled that they were smarter and more well-behaved. Then, after making the case that the blue-eyed kids were inferior, Elliott, the teacher, proceeded to give the dark-eyed students special privileges and praise throughout the day. Now, as you would expect, the children of her class internalized this message. She was an authority figure. Obviously, they would listen to what she said. Now, despite sharing the same values, these kids were from the same small town, and they had the same ethnic and cultural and socioeconomic traits. The dark-eyed group came to see themselves as the better group, and their behavior toward the blue-eyed kids changed. It became harsh and degrading. Many of the blue-eyed kids, they lost their passion. They got depressed. Some of them became self-deprecating, making fun of themselves. They became subservient. They tried to gain favor with the brown-eyed classmates. Now, what I found, and what I still find so fascinating about this experiment, is that even though she wasn't a trained psychologist, Elliott was able to capture what would become the key points of social identity theory. And she did so years before this theory was ever published. The full version of social identity theory didn't appear until about a decade later, about 1979. Henry Tajfel, he was at the University of Bristol, came up with the theory. So if you've studied psychology, you'll know that the social identity theory takes empirical research about group interaction and then boils it down. And it explains how prejudice can be manufactured. The theory, in large measure, describes what Elliott had already observed in a grade 3 classroom. So here's what the theory says. First of all, people are not born with personalities that predispose them to prejudice. Instead, people can be trained or conditioned to be prejudiced. The first step in manufacturing bigotry is to have an authority figure divide a population into two distinct groups. The division has to be an identifiable difference, but the difference doesn't have to be significant. It can be something as inconsequential as eye color, or even what hockey team you support, or something crazy like, are you vaccinated or not? But the difference has to be made to seem important. In fact, to create the right conditions for bigotry, the difference between the two groups has to be exaggerated. But the similarities, those similarities, they have to be muted. They have to be downplayed or even ignored. So let me say this in a different way, just in case you're not tracking with me. People who are actually very similar are instead taught to see themselves as profoundly different. What's happening is that an inaccurate binary category comes to replace the hundreds of valid categories into which individuals actually should fall. You know that you are more than the sum of your parts. You know that you are a unique individual. The many nuanced categories that used to define individuals are rejected. They're replaced by a new overarching single category. And for those who buy into this overarching single category, the world becomes split into us and them, the in-group and the out-group. Finally, the theory of social identity concludes. It says this: once people are now identifying as the in-group and the out-group, you don't have to do anything else. Human nature takes over. Or maybe it's more right to say that tribal nature takes over. The theory explains, and let's not forget that Jane Elliott actually saw this in her classroom, people who are convinced that their core identity is linked to some kind of group membership naturally start to belittle and show hostility toward those outside their group. Putting the other group down is the way that they raise their own status. And it's the way that they bond with each other and build unity in their group. Now, it should go without saying that neither the theory of social identity nor Jane Elliott thought that manufacturing bigotry was a good thing. In fact, the whole reason that Elliott did her experiment and the reason that Henry Tajfel published his theory was to tell us what not to do. It was a warning, not a how-to guide. And if they were alive today, they would tell us, whatever you do, for God's sake, whatever you do, don't pick some kind of external characteristic and then make that characteristic the dividing line between the good guys and the bad guys. Don't do that, because for sure you're going to generate hate, and ultimately you will unravel society. Well, welcome to the unraveling. Right now, in our schools, the ideas of social identity theory are on display, but not as a deterrent to hate. It's as an accelerant. Our educational leaders are pouring gasoline where water should be. And the gasoline I'm referring to is critical race theory. Critical race theory divides students by skin color. It attempts to convince them that the membership they hold in a particular racial group is the single greatest way to know the essence of a person. It says your membership in a racial group is the key to your identity. If you are a white student, you are told that your identity is that of oppressor and racist. Even if you don't say racist words, do racist deeds, or think racist thoughts, critical race theory still claims that subconsciously, unconsciously, you are a racist. Because, like all religious cults, the claims of CRT don't require proof. Moreover, as a white student, you're told that if you do experience success, it's not due to your own actions, but it's unearned privilege due to your whiteness. Now, what if you're a black student? It doesn't get any better. Your identity is tied to being an oppressed minority. You're a victim to societal forces that are beyond your power. You're told that you have less personal agency than others. You're taught that any student who's white that doesn't explicitly express their racism, even if unconscious, well, that person's the enemy. So critical race theory has now infiltrated every school board in Canada, and some people are noticing. But as the negative effects of this ideology become more present in our classroom, many schools have taken to lying about it being there. They know that if parents are aware, they will want to reject it. In fact, we saw it at the Hamilton Wentworth School Board. When parents were aware of what was going on, 2/3 said, get that out of our schools. They didn't listen. But 2/3 said, get this out of our schools. Because when parents see, they say, no, not here. But instead, to hide critical race theory in our schools, we hear it called by different names, euphemisms, like anti-racist education or white privilege instruction. Of course, some school boards are so heavily stocked with activists, woke warriors, they don't even try to hide. And I'm speaking now of the Toronto District School Board. They're happy to tell people that they are using critical race theory as the foundational underpinning of their policies. If you follow the journalist John Kay, he just recently exposed many of the Toronto District School Board's documents that speak to this effect. But as I say, most school boards don't mention that they're bringing in critical race theory, that it's infusing their curriculum. They don't tell us that. Instead, they call it anti-racism education. Anti-racism education. Be looking for this. Be listening for this. And remember, it is the same thing as critical race theory. It's CRT dressed in camouflage. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is the term anti-racism education is purposely misleading. After all, who doesn't want to be anti-racist? All of us do. But here's the truth. The ideas in anti-racism education are explicitly racist. Everything that is in CRT is promoted in anti-racism education. And I'm going to give you some proof. The top-selling instruction manual on the topic, it's called How to Be Anti-Racist. It's by the American academic Ibram X. Kendi. That book and its author categorically reject the idea that people should be treated equally. Instead, Kendi insists that to make society equitable, white people must be denied equal treatment. They must also be made to pay for any historical misdeeds that were perpetrated by those who happen to share their same pigmentation, if not relation. The book says this, quote, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination." If this is your first time hearing this quote from the book by Kendi, I can imagine your shock. You're shocked because it's blatant anti-white racism. Well, you should be ready to be horrified. Because if you live in the province of Ontario, all of Kendi's ideas are going to be forced into every classroom with the passage of Bill 16. Bill 16 is a repackaging of Bill 67, which died on the order table in June just before the provincial election. But now, as Bill 16, this proposed law, known as the Racial Equity in the Education System Law, is back, and it has already passed first reading. Now, Bill 16 is a salute to every idea of critical race theory. And if it passes, unity in our schools will be destroyed. Unity will be destroyed because this bill insists that anti-racism education be worked into every piece of curriculum in every course. Math, science, including computer science, things that you would just imagine couldn't have a racial component. They will work it in. This bill also insists that no one will be able to become a teacher unless they write an exam showing fluency in this ideology. Moreover, veteran teachers won't be able to advance in their careers unless they demonstrate efforts to promote racial equity in their schools. Now, did you hear that? To advance in their careers, a teacher must actively promote this divisive ideology in their classroom. At this point, Bill 16 hasn't passed. At this point, it's only passed first reading. It's time to take action. Let your MPP know that this cannot go any further. Let your school board know that you will not stand for this racial division. But listen, even if this bill doesn't pass, the problem in our schools is still massive. It is already the case that many of our current teachers and most of our school board officials are flooding our schools with critical race theory. They don't need to be compelled by the government. They do it because they want to. And for that, they are ignorant fools. To those leaders in our school system who think that dividing students by race and promoting one group over another can ever work out well, I have this to say. You need to learn the lessons from a grade 3 class in Iowa. Thank you.